सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
There are many important issues and debates in our country at any point of time. But if you ask me what are the three of topmost importance right now, one of those would be the state of India's fisc, that is fisc at the center, at the federal or the central level, and also at the states level, that is fiscal deficit, that is revenue deficit, that is what the Prime Minister described as Amdani Athani Kharcha Rupaiya. The fact is that nobody is non-guilty in that area, barring a rare one, if at all. So in this one, everybody is guilty to almost the same extent. It's just that some are a lot more guilty than others. So when you get into a debate like this, what you need is data analysis, because data is the analyst's tool. Data is also the declutterer's tool, because I just can't tell you, oh, this is like this because I think this is like this. I have to find evidence. For that, you need institutions that produce data. Government produces some data, but increasingly, governments are producing less data in India, and particularly at the center, less and less data is coming out. Even if it's coming out, it's coming out too late. So that's why institutions that produce data are very important. And one of those which has risen in the past decade plus is PRS, Parliamentary Research Service, or PRS. This was founded by M.R. Madhavan and C.V. Madhukar, marvelous guys, and Chakshu Roy there heads the legislative and civic engagement initiatives. Now, PRS does a lot of marvelous research. In fact, when I was at the Indian Express, we published a whole book with them, India's Elected, that looked at the track record with data of all our 543 members of parliament, Lok Sabha members. So that's the kind of work PRS does. Now what they've done is they've produced this marvelous discussion paper. It's an eye-opener. This is a discussion paper on state finances, the state of our states. What's happening to the finances of our states? We talked about the finances of the center just maybe a couple of weeks back, right? We talked about fiscal deficit, we talked about India's debt, etc. But what is India? India also consists of all these 30 plus states and union territories. So all of them add up to this larger kitty or the larger pie or the larger cake or pizza or roti, whatever you want to call it, that is India. Now, what is happening with the finances of India's states? And that is an eye-opener. The data that this research is produced, this discussion paper, it's a short one. I will share it with you. You can see it. We will also be using graphics from it. With gratitude to PRS, they've done a lot of our homework for us. I know you keep complaining that we should do more graphics and our graphics are probably not good enough. We are working on that. We're making our graphics better, but right now we have these graphics available. So what are these? What is the big picture that these graphics are telling us and this data is telling us? This data is telling us something for which I will use the old metaphor of a dog and its tail. And if you've been following my work for a long time, you know, if I compare anything or anybody with a dog or a cat, it's not an insult. Least of all, it is mostly a compliment, because we love dogs and cats, and a lot of dog and cat metaphors are common usage. Nobody minds being called a top dog. Nobody likes to be an underdog. Everybody likes to be a top dog. So like that, in Hindi, there is a saying, कि कुत्ते की पूंछ. You know, a dog's tail is usually curled like this. Imagine a dog. That a dog's tail is always curled and remains curled. And the story is that once somebody said, some Badshah or Maharaja said, I will get this dog's tail straightened. So he ordered for the dog's tail to be put in a straight pipe for 12 years. And he said, now this will straighten. But 12 years later, when the pipe was removed, the tail again came back to the original. So in Hindi, they say, कुत्ते की पूंछ को 12 साल नलकी में रखा, 12 साल के बाद नलकी हटाई, फिर ऐसे ही हो गई. So that is the metaphor we use to explain addictions, habits, very durable traits that do not change irrespective of what you do. So that addiction for our government, whether the center or the states, is overspending. It's overspending, it's living beyond their means. So this is Amdani Athani Kharcha Rupaya for everybody. We focused on the center the other day. We had talked about the indebtedness of our states some time back. That was the RBI report that we discussed. I think it was episode 1035. I'll share that link also with you. Now we are looking specifically at the state of the state's budgets. If you now remember or check out that episode 1035, which we did in July sometime, you will see that we had listed the 10 most indebted states in India based on an RBI report. And these 10 most indebted states, these are all usual suspects. And Punjab usually top of the pops, although not the kind of top of the pops they want to be in. But Punjab, most indebted, Rajasthan, Kerala, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh and Jharkhand. They were the 10 most indebted states. These 10 most indebted states also accounted for half of all the expenditure among Indian states, because these also include big states of India, UP, MP, West Bengal, Rajasthan, etc. Now, in all these states, that report had pointed out that just the interest payments on their debt were higher than 10% of their total income. That was one more symptom of Amdani Athani Kharcha Rupaya. Together, there were many states in India which accounted for more than 3% each of India's fiscal deficit. Right? So these were states with shambolic finances. We spoke about those and we are not going to repeat that right now. We had also then said that many of these states were overspending so much that by the time they'd paid salaries, pensions, interest on whatever they had borrowed earlier and subsidies, they were left with almost nothing to build anything, any assets. So again, on the top was Punjab, number 2 Kerala. So Punjab, the ratio of their revenue expenditure, that is expenditure on salary, pensions, interest, subsidies, etc., were 16.6 rupees, and on development, building a new road, buying a new bus, setting up a new hospital, was 1 rupee, which means out of 100 rupees, Punjab had just about 6 rupees left to do anything constructive or to build any assets. Kerala was a little bit less worse at a ratio of 12:1. So they had maybe out of 100 rupees, 8 rupees left, and many other states were also in a bad situation. Now, before we go deeper into the state's finances, we have to understand some basics because we are not economists. Most of us are not economists. So what is revenue deficit and what is fiscal deficit? So revenue deficit is when your expenditure is more than all that you earn by way of your own taxes and central grants, etc. All of that is your revenue. If you spend more than your revenue, that means you have a revenue deficit. And if you are spending all of that money on what is called as revenue items, as I just explained to you, salaries, pensions, interest, subsidies, all the items generally that do not create an asset, then if you are spending more than your revenues on your revenue items, that means you are truly bankrupt. And then to do anything in your state, that is, even to buy a few more buses, you have to borrow even more money, or you have to come to the center to beg for some more under some head or the other. That is one. What is fiscal deficit? So revenue is what a state earns. The fiscal income of a state or the size of the fisc also depends on other incomes that a state might have. For example, income from dividends and share sale, etc., or interest from PSUs it owns. That never happens, almost never happens in real life. There might be some exceptions here and there, but most state-run enterprises are even more loss-making than centers' PSUs. So that is just a notional thing, or you can sell a little bit of land somewhere. The state can auction a land or a bus stand, etc., and that can raise some money. All of that adds up, and that is the fisc. And then you see if your expenditure is more than your fisc, that is the fiscal deficit that you have to top up. And you top that up by borrowing. And that is when your borrowings go up and your interest costs go up and you go deeper and deeper into a debt trap. So now see the state of India's states over the past 10 years. Now, if over the past 10 years, you want to see the state's outstanding liabilities, which means the debts that the states owe to some lender or the other, see this graphic. This graphic runs almost perfectly like this. Almost perfectly like this. What does it show to you? That these liabilities or this debt was at its highest in 2004-2005 as a percentage of GDP. So 2004-2005, that's the year UPA comes in. It was 31.3%. Please see the graphic carefully and see the shape of the graphic, which means every subsequent year this has come down. Coming down is a good thing. Going up is a bad thing. So it keeps coming down lower and lower and lower. So from 31.3, it reaches the lowest point of 21.7. What year is that? That is 2014-15, right? That is the last year of UPA. Then comes NDA, and then we don't know the reasons yet. As soon as the NDA comes in, this graph starts rising. So now this is not state specific, this is for all the states together. So after 2014, the graph begins to rise until it reaches where? It reaches exactly where we began. So this is a back to square one graphic. That's why I've taken the liberty of putting the headline on this graphic, back to square one. So 2004-5, 31.3 came down to 21.7 in 2014-15. Something right must have been done. Some kind of fiscal discipline must have come into the states. And then once again, all caution has been thrown to the winds. And you're back to 31.2% now. And chances are that next year it will be even higher. So that gives you the larger picture, the big picture. And what is the target of deficit? All governments have debt, all governments have deficit. So the debt target for India was set up by what is called as the FRBM Act. Now FRBM Act, which is Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, that would be a bit like that nalki or that pipe in which the dog's tail was put in. That all right, you guys will not learn, you will continue to be profligate and spendthrift, so maybe I'm giving you a law to put your tail in a pipe. So that law was like the pipe in which the tail of our governments was put in, or our political class was put in. FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, that says that by 2024-25, all of India's debt should be within 60% of India's GDP, right? 60% of India's GDP, if that was the situation, would be quite healthy and manageable, because governments borrow, governments also print some money. India could manage that. That would be really as close to a perfect world as India could get, but realistically so. And that is the target that FRBM Act had fixed. Of this, 40% was to come from the center and 20% from the states. Now, leave out the center for right now, but see what is happening with the states. Because you know what happens when your debt goes up and when your deficit goes up, that leads to distortionary taxes, or which I might call extortionary taxes. And that also means that your development expense goes down because you don't have any budgets left for development. Now see what's happened with the states, and see the states which are doing really badly and some states which might be exceptions on the good side. So if you see this chart, again we are taking it from PRS, it tells you some usual suspects. So alright, Arunachal 57% of GDP as debt. You might say Arunachal is a small state, a small GDP, a border state, very little economy, very little business, very little industry. So you can leave it aside and look at the bigger states. So bigger states, the champions are Jammu and Kashmir, 57%. Once again, you might say Kashmir has ongoing problems, it's just been split, etc., etc. So you can leave that aside. So the champion is top of the pops, Punjab, 53%. That is literally a case of Amdani Athani, Kharcha Rupaiya, which means 53% of your GDP is just your debt. And that is for a large state in the country, highest in the country. Then there are some other ones. Himachal Pradesh, 43%. Once again, there is a political lesson there. That state has run up such a high debt. It's not a poor state, They've run this high debt because they are spending money on populism. And in spite of that, the BJP government has lost power there. So this idea that you just keep throwing money at the voters and voters are so stupid and so greedy that they'll keep voting for you is not correct. So 43% in Himachal, 40% in Rajasthan. Now that's a point that I've made in the past also, and I will repeat it because Rajasthan is a state which has among the worst financial indicators in the country. That's despite the fact that Rajasthan gets a sizable amount of revenues as royalty on crude oil that Vedanta pulls out in its onshore oil fields. In spite of that, Rajasthan is in such a mess. In fact, traveling through Rajasthan in 2013 during the covering the elections, as part of my election series, Writings on the Wall, I had written something that said, Rajasthan is actually the Karam Bhumi of Sonianomics. That is just full distributive political economy. And see the consequences. At that time, Congress had got wiped out despite all those giveaways. At this point, those giveaways, if anything, are even more intense, and the bankruptcy also is even more intense. Now again, if you read this report, this tells you that between 2015-16 and 2019-20, so this report tells us that 8 states of India observed a revenue deficit for all the years between 2015 to 2015-16 and 2019-20. All the years, consistent record, right? Teddy Chal, constantly. That is Andhra Pradesh, Haryana, Kerala, Punjab, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, Uttarakhand and West Bengal. So in 2022-23, for 2022-23, 15th Finance Commission came with a recommendation that center should give a top-up grant of 86,000 crores to some of the states to pull them out of this trap. These states were Andhra, Himachal, Kerala, Punjab, Rajasthan, Tripura and West Bengal. If no such grants were provided and expenditures were kept the same, which means no further income came, center gave no oxygen and the states continue to have the same expenditure, then 6 more states would observe revenue deficit. And these states would be Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim and Uttarakhand. Over the next 3 years further, these grants are to substantially reduce because the center can't keep on producing grants and distributing them to you. When that happens, 5 more states will go into revenue deficit. That is Haryana, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. So at this point, all of these states either have to increase their revenues or to cut their deficit. In fact, indications are none of them is doing any such thing. And in fact, they can possibly get a little more help from the center. They can be allowed to borrow a little more money to the extent of 0.5% of their GSTP, that is a gross state domestic product. But that will be linked to some power reforms. And no state government of India is going to institute any power reforms. Do you want to see the state of your power companies? The debt built up by our power companies in our states. Today, look at this figure and hold your breath. 5.9 lakh crores. That is 5.9 trillion rupees. In fact, even between 2017-18 and 2020-21, a debt or a loss of 2.9 lakh crore has been built up by state governments, power distribution companies. And what happens is that because these distribution companies are owned by the state governments, in some states, state government is distributing power directly. But even if it's a state government owned company, this is a contingent liability upon the state government. The state government is supposed to fund the losses of these companies. So 2.9 lakh crores just between 17-18 and 2021. The total losses of power companies, 5.9 lakh crores. There is some incentive if these states reform their power sector. But you know what? The risks politically are too high. Once you get your people used to having free power, very few would agree to start paying for it voluntarily or happily or on their own. That is where our fiscal discipline has got stuck. And that's the reason I say, कुत्ते की पूंछ पाइप में डालने के बावजूद, in spite of the FRBM Act, is not straightening because that is a compulsion of India's politics, unfortunately, and that has now become ossified. So there is this other chart now which we are looking at. That is the chart of fiscal deficit of the various states for 22-23 as per budget estimates, and this is a percentage of GSDP. Now, Government of India, central government allows 3% 3% is tolerable. All right, a state can run up to 3% of its GDP as deficit. But again, look at some champion states. Okay, the highest is Manipur at 6.5%, but we'll rule Manipur out because it's a small state with a small economy with a lot of trouble, etc., etc. But there are other state governments which are doing quite badly. Himachal Pradesh, again, 5%. You ran up such a deficit and still got defeated so thoroughly in the elections. That means either you didn't spend the money well, or your voters are too smart just to vote for you because you're giving them freebies. Look at Punjab, 3.8%. Not as bad as I might have expected it to be, but still 3.8% is higher than the norm. Madhya Pradesh, 4.6%. Goa is a rich state, 4.7%. And Rajasthan, as you would expect, 4.4%. So all these states are defying their norm of a maximum of 3% of GDP as their deficit. Now, we have said a lot of harsh things about the states, but the states also might have a complaint. And that complaint is, ever since GST came in, the states' share that they get from the center for GST actually is lower than the revenue they used to collect when they had the power to levy all these taxes. All those taxes got subsumed by the center in GST on the simple promise that, look, you give the power of levying all these taxes to us, we will levy these taxes and we'll give you a share out of these, and in the course of time your share will become higher, and until that share catches up, we will give you a top up. Look at the picture. Look at what has happened right now to the states. If you look at tax to GDP ratio under the GST regime, before GST, that is 2015-16 to 2016-17, look at this graphic. It is 6.5%, 6.7%. So usually the expectation is at this point that taxes subsumed under GST will at least come up to 6.7% of GDP. That was the situation pre-GST. It was 6.5% in 2015-16 and 6.7% in 2016-17. Then what happens? 2018-19 is the first year of GST. It declined. It falls quite rapidly from 6.7% to 5.4%. Next year, 5.2%, then 4.9%, then 5.4%. You see twin bars for these years on this graphic. Second bar, the yellow colored bar, that is the bar showing the share from GST that the state gets. The other bar, the blue bar, that is what this GST becomes after a top up from the center. That is the compensation from the center. But even after the compensation, the total amount that the states are getting is 5.9% for 18-19, 5.7%, 5.4%, 5.9%. It is substantially lower than what the states would have earned if they were levying these taxes together. And now these top-up grants are coming to an end, and that is why the states are complaining. So while the center lectures the states to become more disciplined, to reform their power sector, to not give away freebies, to not use their money to buy votes, free power, free this, free that, free etc., the states also are rising and asking tough questions. Obviously, BJP-run states cannot ask that question, but other states are now asking that question. But look, our share of GST has gone down. We can't manage like this. And this has some dangers, and this has some danger for center-state relations, because already we have seen so many of the states, the non-BJP-run states, pulling away from the new pension scheme because they find a populist idea as in restoring the old pension scheme. Similarly, we do not want a situation. The last thing India needs is some states now threatening or maybe actually pulling away from the GST, saying that they have a loss of revenues because of GST. So with that, I'll show you a final graphic, that is figure number 7. That is devolution of taxes as a percentage of gross tax revenue. Now, if you see the period up to 2014-15, the norm then was 32%, because remember there was no GST. The center was not collecting taxes on everything as it's doing now. States had the power to collect taxes in many areas. Then the expected norm was 32%, but roughly between 2010-11 and 14-15, that is the second term of UPA, the norm was that 27 to 28% was paid to the states. Now with GST, norm has been raised to 42%. Since the norm has been raised to 42%, the actual money transferred to the states is on an average about 32%. They are 35, 35, 37, 32. So if you average it out over the past 5 years, it's only 37%. That's 8 percentage point lower than the norm. So 42% compared to 42%, which is expected, it's only 34%. And that's why the states are complaining. In the subsequent years, that is 2021, 22, 23, when 15th Finance Commission has lowered the norm to 41%, in fact, state share has gone down further. It's now 29%, 30%, and 30%. And that's why the states are complaining like hell, and they also have a right to complain. So once again, we do a lot of analysis, we have a lot of opinion, but we need not necessarily do data-free analysis. That is why when good data like this comes up, this is something to welcome because we have something to talk about with evidence.